Hi everybody, this is lesson 7.1.1, Sampling Distributions, lesson 1, and the first lesson of Math 21B. So let's pick up where we left off in the last class. We're going to be talking about the big picture here, okay? Statistical analysis is a process containing 4 steps, okay? These are represented below. Step 1 is always to ask a question that can be answered with data. And again, we're talking about the general statistics process, okay? So step 1 is to ask a question that can be answered with data. Step 2 is to decide what to measure and then collect data. Step 3 is to summarize and analyze the data. And step 4 is to draw a conclusion and communicate the results. Okay? Now, notice in the picture that we have population and we have sample. The idea, if you recall, is that the population is everybody that you're asking a question about, but sample is the set of people or things that you actually select to actually run the experiment on or to ask the question. Okay? So the 4th step is the one that we want to study right now, okay? This is to draw a conclusion and communicate the results. So we're going to be focusing on categorical data. Remember, categorical data differs from quantitative data. Quantitative data is when you have a number that's used to measure something. For example, how tall somebody is or how old they are. These are things that are measured with numbers, but categorical data is something that can't be measured with a number, like, for example, what color somebody's hair is, or whether they are male or female, something like that. Okay? So we are going to be using proportions and percentages to summarize categorical data. With categorical variables, we know whether each individual in the sample or population falls into some category. We summarize the data by calculating a proportion, which means that we divide the total number who fall into the category by the total sample or population size. We will use categorical data from samples to draw conclusions about population proportions. A population proportion is the proportion for the entire population. Okay? We're going to go more in detail in a moment as to what all of these symbols, what symbols can be used to talk about these things. When we use sample data to draw a conclusion about a population, we say we are making a statistical inference about the population. In this module, we learn about 2 main types of inference. The first is using sample data to estimate a population proportion, and that's going to be the first couple of lessons. And the second is using sample data to test a claim about a population proportion. That's going to be lessons 7.3.1 through 7.3.4. Before we learn about the 2 types of inference, we need to explore how proportions vary as we take different samples. Okay? First, let's look at the types of questions that we'll try to answer using statistical inference. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about M&Ms. Okay, think about M&Ms. M&Ms have several colors, and I believe that M&Ms have, how many colors do they have? I think there's 5 colors, something like that, 5 or 6 colors of M&Ms. So one question that we can ask is what proportion of all M&Ms are blue? And which type of inference will help us answer this question? Okay. So what do we think? What kind of inference is going to help us answer this question? So let's go back. Remember, we said there are 2 types of inference, right? We've got the first is using samples. So using sample data to estimate a population proportion. And the second is using sample data to test a claim. Are we testing a claim here, or are we actually estimating a population proportion? Well, it says what proportion is blue. That's not a claim, that's a question, right? They're asking us this. Okay, so this is estimate a population proportion. Okay. Now, let's look at number 2. A student in class claims that less than 1/3 of all M&Ms are blue. We want to answer the question, is she correct? Which type of inference will help us answer this question? So which is it? Are we estimating a population proportion, or are we testing a claim? Well, in this case, the student claimed that less than 1/3 of all M&Ms are blue, and we're just trying to decide if that's true or not. Okay, so we are not estimating a proportion, we're testing a claim, aren't we? So let's write that down. Test a claim about the population proportion. Okay. If you need to learn the population proportion of M&Ms that is blue, and the manufacturer refuses to tell you, what should you do? Okay, so let's think about this question, right? A population proportion means we want to know the proportion of something being true. In this case, the thing that we care about is what is the proportion of M&Ms that are blue, right? The smallest you could get is 0. That means there are no blues at all, which we know is not true, right? Blue is a color that an M&M can be. And the highest that it could be is 100%, right? That would be if all M&Ms in the world were blue. But we know that it's something in between that, right? We know not all M&Ms are blue, and we know that at least some are blue. So how would we figure this out? Okay. So what would we do? I mean, what we could do is we could maybe buy a random bag of M&Ms and see how many blues are inside of it, and that could help us calculate a proportion. Now, of course, we don't expect this to equal the exact answer, but it's at least something, right? So let's write this down. How about we gather a large sample of M&Ms and compute the proportion of blues in the sample. Okay, let's keep going here. To investigate the proportion of M&Ms that is blue, we need to gather data. Will the data we collect be quantitative or categorical? Well, let's think about the color blue, right? Blue is a color, it's not a number, right? We're not asking, for example, how much does the average M&M weigh? That would be different, right? We would be measuring with numbers. Okay, but we are not measuring something here. In this case, we're just essentially counting blues, right? So this is considered categorical. Okay. How would we summarize the data? So let's say that we got a sample and we calculated how many blues we had in that sample. How would we summarize the data? Okay. Well, what we could do is we could use proportions. This is a natural way, right? We could count the number of blues within the sample, and then we could divide it by the total size, and that would be the proportion, right? So let's just say we could use or compute a proportion. What is a proportion, right? Let me write this down. It would be the number of blues in sample divided by the size of the sample. Okay, so that's what we are going to be doing. Okay. Let's look at number 6. You also want to learn the average age of people who eat M&Ms. So this is sort of a hypothetical here, right? What if you also wanted to learn the average age of people, and you decide to gather ages from randomly selected M&M eaters? Are these data values quantitative or categorical? Well, ages are numbers, aren't they? Right? They're measured with numbers. So this is considered quantitative. Okay. How would you summarize this data? Well, let's say that you got a bunch of people and you calculated all of their ages and you wanted to figure out the average age. We would just find the average, right? So we could say, find the mean age in the sample. Find the mean age in the sample. Okay? So, in this module, we use sample data and probability to investigate questions like the ones above about population proportions. Okay? So, we're going to move on here. And let's do the official introduction here where we can learn about some of the symbols. Again, suppose that we want to know the proportion of all M&Ms that is blue. For each M&M candy, the variable is whether or not the M&M is blue. When we consider a single M&M, if it is blue, we call it a success, and if it is any other color than blue, we call it a failure. Note that success doesn't mean good and failure doesn't mean bad, even though we normally think of those words that way. A success is just the outcome we are interested in, and failure is anything else. The proportion of all M&Ms that is blue is the total number of blue M&Ms divided by the total number of M&Ms in the world, okay? This population proportion is an example of a parameter. A population proportion is denoted by the symbol P. So it helps us to look in this box right here. Parameters are numerical summaries of populations, and statistics are numerical summaries of samples. Okay? So a parameter talks about everything, and a statistic just talks about the sample. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So it says we calculate the proportion of M&Ms that is blue in a sample by dividing the number of blue M&Ms in the sample by the number of M&Ms in the sample, which is called the sample size. The proportion of M&Ms that is blue in a sample is an example of a statistic. A sample proportion is denoted by the symbol p hat. It's a p with a little hat above it. Okay? So it says p hat is equal to the number of successes in the sample divided by the sample size. Okay? This is extremely important. We're going to be using this symbol p hat all the time. We're also going to be using the symbol p all the time. So what is the difference between p and p hat? Well, this helps us understand it, this next part here. It says it is important to recognize that there are many samples of M&Ms, and each one is going to have its own proportion of blue candies, but there is only one population proportion. Right? If I put a sample of M&Ms in a cup and we count the blues, and then I put another sample of M&Ms in a different cup, we don't expect them both to have the same number of blues in them, right? And so they have different p hats. Maybe in one of them, a third of them are blue, but in the other one, a quarter of them are blue. That means that p hat would be a quarter for the first, a third, and then p hat would be a quarter for the second one. So this is important, okay? Each sample has its own sample proportion, but there is only one population proportion. Okay? The population proportion does not vary. Okay? So, I want you to think of it this way, right? P hat is talking about the sample. So this changes every time, but P, this is talking about the population, right? This is the actual real answer, okay? But the problem is, this is a mystery. We never know this number, right? If we had a way to count every single blue in the world, every single blue M&M in the world, we would not need statistics, right? But the whole point of why we need statistics is that we cannot count that. So we can only take samples and then use that to try to estimate what the population proportion is. Okay, we use sample statistics to either estimate a population parameter or test a claim made about a population parameter. In this activity, we will gather multiple samples of 25 M&Ms from a population. We will calculate a sample proportion p hat for each sample. Our many different samples will produce many different sample proportions. These proportions are just a small part of the collection of all sample proportions. The collection of all sample proportions forms a distribution of values called the sampling distribution of sample proportions. What does this mean? This means that every time we take a sample, we can calculate the sample proportion. And if we were to do this over and over and over again, we would build a collection of all these called the sampling distribution. Okay, so what is the population then that we're talking about? The population would be all M&Ms. And what's our sample going to be? We're going to pretend that we are taking a sample of 25 M&Ms. 25 M&Ms. What would be the parameter then? P would be the proportion of blue candy in the population. That would be P. And the statistic then would be the proportion of blue candy in the sample. Right? So that's the difference, right? The parameter is the proportion of blues in the entire population. The statistic is the proportion of blues just in that 25 sample cup. So let's move on. So it says, your instructor has given you a cup that contains a random sample of 25 M&Ms. Now, of course, because if we were in a classroom, we would do this experiment as a team. And so what we would do is I would give each of you a cup of 25 random M&Ms, and you would count the total number of each color that appears. So there are 6 colors here: blue, brown, green, orange, red, yellow. And then there's the total. Okay? So I took a sample of 25 M&Ms myself, and I counted the number of each color under the cup, and this is what I got, okay? I got 4 blues. I got 4 blues. I got 5 brown. I got 5 green. I got 6 orange. I got 2 red. And I got 3 yellow. Okay, that's how many I had. Out of the 25 M&Ms in my cup, that's how many of each color I had. And so, of course, if you add those up, you get 25 total. So what would the proportion of each one be? Okay, so we can figure this out by using our calculator. So what is the proportion of blues under the cup? So I have 4 blues out of 25. So what's 4 divided by 25? If you do that in your calculator, you get 0.16. So I'm going to put that right here, 0.16. Okay. What about the brown? If I do 5 divided by 25, I get 0.2 or 0.20. 5 divided by 25, again, it is 0.2. 6 divided by 25, if I do that in the calculator, I get 0.24. 2 divided by 25, I get 0.08. 3 divided by 0.25, I get 0.12. And if you add up all of those numbers we got on the bottom, we add up to 1. And that makes sense because that gives us 100%, right? That's everything. So what did we figure out? The one that we care about is this one, right? What we care about is the proportion of blues that exist in all M&Ms in the world, right? And so what we just found is the proportion of blues that's under our cup. So what did we get for our p hat? Our p hat was 0.16 in this problem. Do we believe, or do you believe, that your sample proportion will be the same as the population proportion? Why or why not? What is this asking us? So what this is saying, or what this is telling you, is that we got 16% blue under our cup. Okay? Do you think that 16% of all M&Ms in the world are blue? I mean, it was true for what was under my cup, but is that going to be true for all M&Ms in the world? Do we think there's exactly 16%? Why or why not? Okay. Well, I mean, the thing to notice, right, is that every time we look under a cup, there's going to be a random number of blues in there. We expect that maybe it's going to be near the real answer, but it's not going to be exactly the real answer every time, right? So I will say, since every sample is a little different, we do not expect p hat to be the same as p. Now, if we were in class, you guys would each fill out this table on your own. And so my p hat was 0.16, but you guys would each give me different p hats, right? One of you might get 0.20, another one might get 0.26, another one might get 0.28. Everybody should get a different answer here, okay? And then what I could do is I could ask you to put these all on a board, okay? So here's what I mean by that. We're going to use this table right here to do this. And I'm going to begin by putting my sample on there, okay? So I got 0.16. So I'm going to put a dot right here. This is called a dot plot, right? This is one p hat. But what I'm going to do is I've used a computer to generate lots of samples, and I'm going to show you guys what these samples look like. So the first sample got 0.24. So let's call that student number 1. Student number 2 got 0.36. Student number 3 got 0.24. So I'm going to put a dot right here. Student number 4 got 0.32. Student number 5 got 0.2. Student number 6 got 0.24. I'll just keep going here. 0.24 again. 0.32. 0.28. 0.28 again. 0.24. 0.28. 0.32. 0.08. 0.24. 0.16. 0.28. 0.28. 0.24. 0.20. 0.24. 0.24. 0.48. That student got a lot of blues, right? 0.28. 0.20. 0.24. 0.28. 0.20. 0.28. 0.20. 0.24. 0.28. 0.24. 0.12. And we're going to stop there, okay? This is, I think, about 30. This is pretending like we had 35 students in the class, and each one of them did this with their own cup and 25 M&Ms. Okay, so these are going to be the numbers that we work with. Okay. So we notice a shape here that results from the problem. So question, as students add their sample proportions to the table, did everybody have the same sample proportion? So the answer is no, right? The students got different answers. Of course, some answers matched, but the sample proportions varied between students. Okay, let's keep going here. It says, think about the dot plot created by you and your class. Each dot represents a sample proportion of M&Ms that are blue. Give your best estimate of the population proportion of all M&Ms that is blue. Okay, so this is the key idea here. So we need to think about this. If somebody were to ask you, how many M&Ms or what proportion of M&Ms do we think are blue in the entire world, what could we do? I could be stubborn and I could look at just my answer and I could say, well, I got 0.16, so that's my guess. But that's not really taking all the other students into account, right? Because they all got a different answer. So what's the smart thing to do here? The smart thing to do is to look at all of this as a whole and try to think about where we think the real answer sits. So what do you think? I mean, if I'm looking at this picture, if somebody were to ask me to pick the real answer, one thing you might want to do is think, where do most of the values tend to be? And do we notice do we notice that this area right here seems to be in the middle of all the data? Right? Because we sort of have a little bell curve here, don't we? And so if we were to take all the students into account and not just my cup, we notice that 0.24 seems to be the most reasonable answer. Okay? So I'm going to say the best estimate, the best estimate for P is 0.24. Okay. By the way, we could write this as 0.24. It's the same thing, okay? Whether you write it as 0.24 or 0.24, it is the same number. Okay? Okay. The dot plot that we constructed is called, or it's part of what we call the sampling distribution, right? If we were to do this forever and keep getting a sample of 25 M&Ms, we would just do this over and over and over. Then we would get more and more dots in our picture, and we would be constructing what's called a sampling distribution of sample proportions. Okay? Okay, so let's keep going here. It says you need to know. Again, these you need to know boxes are super important. These summarize the definitions. A sampling distribution of sample proportions is the distribution of all possible sample proportions from samples of a given size. A sampling distribution is a description of all possible values of a statistic from random samples of a given size. Why are we saying of a given size? Well, in this case, we're talking about our size was 25, right? Because every sample had 25 M&Ms in it. So we're always going to care about what the sample size is. We want to make sure that we get a large enough sample. We'll talk about that later in the course as to what makes a big enough sample. Okay, so let's move on here. It says, for number 9, think about the distribution of sample proportions on the board. Describe the shape of the distribution of sample proportions. What is the shape? I mean, let's look at this. What shape does this appear to have? Well, to me, and let me use a different color for this. Maybe I'll use red. For me, this looks like a bell curve, right? Do we agree with that? That looks sort of like a bell curve. So we called that a bell-shaped distribution, right? So I'm going to say approximately bell-shaped. Next part, estimate the mean of the sample proportions in the dot plot. The mean, remember what the mean is. If it's bell-shaped, the mean is in the middle, right? And so the mean seems to also be 0.24, right? That's the mean. I'll say the mean is about 0.24. What do we notice about these two numbers, right? It says in 8D, we thought about what the real answer would be for the M&Ms, and we guessed 0.24. And now, when they asked us for the mean, we also got 0.24. So the point is that these are the same. So let's write that down. The mean of sample proportions Sorry, I accidentally skipped ahead. It says the mean of, the mean of sample proportions is about the same as the population proportion. This is extremely important, okay? This is going to be a key idea that we use throughout this course, okay? So let's go to the next part here. In statistics, we use samples to make inferences about populations. In Module 7, we use sample proportions to make inferences about population proportions. We summarize these ideas below. So these are all the terms that we have discussed in this lesson so far. The population, okay? Population is all individuals or objects of interest to a researcher. The sample would be part of the population used to represent the entire population. The parameter would be a numerical value that summarizes the population. The statistic would be a numerical value that summarizes the sample. A success or failure would be the outcome that we are or are not interested in for a categorical variable. The distribution of sample proportions is all possible values of the sample proportion and how often it takes on each value. Now remember that every sample must have the same size. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to identify each of those elements in the M&M activity that we just did. So what would a success be? A success would be an M&M that is blue. What would a failure be? A failure in this case is an M&M that is not blue. Okay, what would the population be? Remember, a population is everything that we care about here. What are we asking about? We're asking about all M&Ms. So let me just say all M&Ms that exist, which is way too many for us to actually count, right? And so what would the parameter be? Remember, a parameter is the value that summarizes the population. So what we care about here are the proportion of blue M&Ms. The proportion of all M&Ms that exist. And this is the letter P. Okay, what would be our sample? Remember, the sample is the part of the population that we use to represent the entire population. So what was our sample in this problem? Well, the cup had 25 M&Ms in it, right? So that would be 25 M&Ms in a cup. That would be our sample. What are the statistics? Remember, the statistics, this is P hat. What would that be? This is the proportion of blue M&Ms in each cup. Right? So the difference between P hat and P is that this is the proportion of all M&Ms that exist, and this is the proportion of, sorry, I wrote something wrong earlier. Let me just do a quick eraser here. this shouldn't be of all M&Ms. This should be of blue M&Ms, right? So blue. So the proportion of blue M&Ms that exist, the proportion of blue M&Ms in each cup, right? So there's the difference, right? Difference between what percent of M&Ms in your cup are blue versus the percent of M&Ms in the whole world that are blue, right? So what would the sampling distribution be? This would be the distribution of the collection of sample proportions from samples of 25 M&Ms. Okay, so that would be our sampling distribution. In the next part of the lesson, we use a computer to further simulate part of the sampling distribution of sample proportions of blue M&Ms. Counting out candies is time-consuming and inefficient, but technology can be used to better simulate a distribution of sample proportions. We now use a computer to simulate additional sample proportions. Download and open the blue M&M simulation at, and here's the website. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys what happens when I follow the instructions here, but follow along in your notes. And I want to also point out that this link, if you want to try this on your own, which I highly recommend, this link works best with the browser Google Chrome. I've tried it with different browsers and it doesn't seem to work, okay? Another thing you have to note is that having Microsoft Excel may be required for you to run this, okay? So if you don't have Microsoft Excel, you may need to acquire that first, okay? Okay. We're going to run the simulation now. So on the right, I have the simulation, and on the left, I'm going to put in our answers, okay? So please follow along with me on the worksheet. So we're doing number 11 right now. Let's set P to 0.24 and N to 25. So I'm going to put 0.24 here, and then N is already at 25. Here we're going to assume that 24% of all M&Ms are blue and that we're taking samples of 25. And what this program is going to do is it's going to generate 1,000 samples. So it's going to pretend that we have 1,000 people in the class doing this experiment. So if we do that, we get the following. This is what our dots would look like. Okay? Okay, so let's answer part A. It says with N equal 25 and P equals 0.24, describe the shape of the distribution of sample proportions. So this looks to me pretty bell-shaped, doesn't it? It looks like it's bell-shaped but slightly skewed to the right. So let's write this down. The distribution is slightly bell-shaped, or not slightly, sorry, is approximately bell-shaped and slightly skewed to the right. Okay, it also wants us to, so it says describe the shape. We could say that we can describe it further. Let me go to the next line here. It is centered at around, this middle looks to me at about 0.24, right? Right here, at around 0.24. And the range, what's the range here? Oh, it looks like we have a dot at 0 and also a dot a little bit above 0.5. So maybe we'll say the range is about 0.52, is about or maybe 0.53, let's say, or 0.53. Okay, so that's our part A. Part B says visually estimate the mean of the distribution of simulated sample proportions. How does your estimate compare to the population proportion of M&Ms that is blue? So we look at this, of course, the mean, we've already sort of answered this when we said the center. It is about 0.24, right? So let's write that down. The mean is close to 0.24. Well, let me write it as 0.24 just so it's close, or it's easy to follow. So the mean is close to 0.24. And how does it compare to our population proportion? Well, look, we've got 0.24 up here is our population proportion. So I will say the mean is equal to the population proportion. Let me be more specific. The mean of the sampling distribution is equal to the population proportion. Okay. Let's do part C. It says, how does the distribution compare to the one our class constructed on the board in terms of shape, center, and spread? Well, I mean, the one that we constructed looked very similar to this, right? The only difference is this has a lot more points. So I'll just say they are similar in terms of shape, center, and spread, but this has way more points. Remember, it has 1,000 and ours just had 35 points. 1,000 versus 35. Okay. Okay. So let's now look at part D. It says the population proportion of M&Ms that is blue is 0.24. Your sample from question 8A probably deviates from this. If your sample proportion is used to estimate the population proportion, the deviation is an error. What is the error in the sample proportion? So if you recall, our answer under my cup, let's just go with what I had under my cup. Remember that under my cup, so I will just call it p hat, was equal to 0.16, right? 0.16. And p was equal to 0.24. Okay, so this means that there is an error. The error is equal to 0.16 minus 0.24. Right? We want to know how far away we were from the real answer. So if we put 0.16 minus 0.24 in our calculator, we actually get that it's negative 0.08. Negative 0.08. Most of the sample proportions deviate from the population proportion. We're doing part E now. Okay? Most of the sample proportions deviate from the population proportion. Look at the dot plot and think about the average error in the sample proportions plotted there. Give your best guess about the value of the average error. This is a little hard to think about, but I want us to look at this picture here. Okay, the dots that are right here are not, there's no error, right? Because they're exactly in the middle, but all the other dots are a little bit further away. Okay, so I want us to estimate what we think on average, how far away these things are. And I'm going to say that maybe the average distance is about right here, right? Because some dots are further, some dots are closer. So the average distance is something like that. So it's about from here to here. If we look at the scale there, that's about 0.08 or 0.09. So I will say, I'll type that here for part E. the average error appears to be, actually, let's make this simple, right? It looks like it's about from here to here. I'm going to go from this notch to this notch, okay? So that would be about 0.10. I don't know, 0.10. Again, we're eyeballing here. I don't want to, I don't want, we're going to give an exact number soon, but again, we're just eyeballing from the picture, right? Where the average error. The key word here is average. I'm even going to put that in bold right now, okay? Because some errors are more and some are less, but that's the average error. Okay, so now part F says, the simulation displays the standard deviation of the simulated sample proportions. This can be used to describe the spread of their distribution. What is this value? So the standard deviation of the sampling of the simulated sample proportions is what? Well, it says it right here, actually. It says 0.086. This is it right here. 0.086. Okay, remember what standard deviation means? This is just on average how far away things are from the mean. Okay. Okay. So we are going to go on to the next steps. So next steps. The proportion of all M&Ms that is blue is 0.24. In the dot plot of sample proportions from the computer simulation, the mean should be very close to 0.24. So this is not a coincidence that the 0.24 that we put in the simulation matched the middle of that bell curve. That is the whole point of this lesson, is to understand this fact. So we denote the mean of the sample proportions as mu sub p hat. If this is hard to see, let me go ahead and write this again in a little bit bigger text. But this guy right here, we put a mu with a little p hat there. This is just the mean of the sample distributions, or the sample proportions. So we have seen that this mean is equal to the population proportion, and so we get the following equation. Mu sub p hat is equal to p. Again, that's just saying that the mean of the bell curve, if we do this experiment over and over, will be the real answer. The standard deviation of sample proportions is called the standard error of sample proportions. Okay, we denote that with the sigma symbol, sub p hat. Okay, remember guys, from the earlier class, we learned that this is how you say mean, and this symbol is how you say the standard deviation. So the p hat just means that we are looking at only p hats, and we're looking at the mean of those and the standard deviation of those. You notice we say standard error here. Standard error and standard deviation is basically interchangeable. Okay, so the standard error, the formula for standard error is the following. Mu sub p hat is equal to, I want you guys to look at this. This is the square root of p times 1 minus p divided by n. P times 1 minus p divided by n. Now, this is important, okay? Different samples will result in different sample proportions. I'm reading this box right now. We measure this variability with the standard deviation. Since the sample proportion is an estimate for the population proportion, we can consider the difference between the two to be an error in the estimation. For this reason, we call the standard deviation of the sample proportions the standard error. All right? Now, we are going to look at this formula. right? This formula we're going to be using all the time. So again, don't worry about memorizing formulas because all of these formulas will be given on exams, just as a heads up. Okay, we're just going to focus on how to use the formulas in class, okay? The population proportion of M&Ms that is blue is 0.24. What is the mean of all sample proportions of M&Ms that are blue? So let's answer the question. Mu sub p hat, remember, we just learned that that's basically equal to p. And so that's the same as 0.24. Okay? So there's not really something that we have to do there. So let's look at the next part. What is the standard error of sample proportions of M&Ms that are blue? Again, this is going to be the standard error of all sample proportions. Now, we're not going to use what we got in the computer simulation, right? Remember we got 0.086 from there? What we're going to do is we're going to calculate it on our own by using that formula. Remember, the formula is equal to the square root of p times 1 minus p divided by the sample size, n. Okay? So what would that be in our problem? Well, the sample size is 25. Remember, we had 25 M&Ms in each cup, so that's going to go on the bottom. P is equal to 0.24. So all I'm doing is I'm replacing the P with 0.24, and my sample size, n, is equal to 25. And I do want to demonstrate putting this in the calculator just so that you guys can see how to do this on your own. Hi everybody. Because a lot of you have a TI-84, I wanted to demonstrate how to do the calculation that we talked about with a TI-84 as well. So the way we're going to do it in this one is a little bit different. We're going to actually start by doing the second. So you see the square root button right here. We want to access that. So we're going to do second and then square root. If we hit that square root button, it looks like this. See, we have a square root symbol right there. Now we want to tell it what's under the square root. So I'm going to put 0.24 and then a parentheses 1 minus 0.24. Now if I close the parentheses, this is what it looks like. Then I'm going to do divided by, push the divided symbol, and I get that, and I'm going to divide this by 25. Okay? So this is exactly what I calculated with my computer calculator before. And if I hit the enter button here, you notice we get this same answer as before. I'm going to round it to 0.085. Okay guys, so now we see that we actually got 0.085 here. 0.085. So what we did is we just calculated the real answer of the standard error. Remember, when our computer did the simulation, we actually got 0.086. So we could see that the simulation gave us almost the exact same thing that we got. How do the mean and standard error we computed in questions 12A and 12B compare to those we estimated in 11B and 11F? They were very close. Okay, very close. Okay. So let's look at part D. It says, look at the dot plot from the simulation and think about the sample proportions that you and your classmates collected. What sample proportions would you say are unlikely or unusual? Why? So to answer this question, we're going to look at the simulation again. Looking back at this, right, we're answering part D here. We're trying to figure out which sample proportions are unlikely or unusual. So I would say that anything below 0.10 seems to be pretty unusual, right? Because out of 1,000 times, it occurred 30 or less times. See that, right? Because we have 20 and 40 here. These guys occurred very little. So I would say anything below 0.10 or anything above 0.40, right? These are very rare as well. So let's write this down. For D, unusually low values for the sample proportion are 0.10 or below. And then I'll say unusually high values for the sample proportion are above or 0.40 or above. Now this is just sort of eyeballing, right? 0.40 or above. So they form the left and right tails of the distribution. Okay? So that is what we're going to put for part D. Okay? So let's go ahead and continue on. Because we are going to use this distribution picture, I'm going to keep it on this window. So let's move on to the next steps. What we are going to do now is we're going to investigate the role that sample size has upon the distribution of sample proportions. Right? So remember, the entire example that we just did is assuming that we have 25 M&Ms. But the question we're going to ask now is what happens when we increase the number of M&Ms that we use? Okay, so let's look at number 13. We now investigate what happens to the distribution of sample statistics if we change the sample size. Recall that the sample size is the number of M&Ms in each sample. If we increase the sample size, do you think the distribution of sample proportions will be narrower or wider? What do we think is going to happen? Let's think about when weird things can happen, right? So if you had a cup that, let's say, had 50 M&Ms, do you expect the proportion of blues to get closer to the real answer or further away from the real answer? Well, the more that we have, the less variation there can be. And that's one of the key facts of this module. Okay? So in other words, we would expect that the more of these, or the more sample, the higher that our sample size is, the narrower that this gets. So we're going to write that down for number 13 for part A. We expect the distribution to get narrower as we increase the sample size. Okay. Okay, so let's go on. It says, change the sample size in the simulation to the values in the table below. Write in the standard deviation of the newly simulated sample proportions for each sample size. Below each standard deviation, compute the standard error for the sample size and evaluate if they are similar. Okay? Okay, so let's go on and let's figure out what we have. So the first set, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to create a table here. We're doing the table, remember, this is for part B of number 13. And I want to create a table, and the reason for that is remember, I want to use the simulation and I want to do this all in the same window. So we have, this is going to be a 3x4 table, like this. And here is the sample size. Here is 10. Sorry, I'm just recreating the table that's in your book, okay? And this is 200. And this is going to be the standard deviation. You don't have to write this down. Again, it's in your book. And this is going to be the standard error. Okay, so let's go with first a sample size of 10. What do you think is going to happen in the picture if we do a sample size of 10? So let's start by, I'm going to go to n here. Remember, n is the sample size, and instead of 25, we're going to do a sample size of 10, and we're going to see what happens to the picture. What happened? So it appeared to get really, really wide, right? So what would be the standard deviation of the sample proportions? It says it right here. It's 0.138. So I'm going to put 0.13. Sorry about that. 0.138 right here. Okay. So 0.138. Now, what do you think is going to happen if we increase the sample size to 100? Do you guys notice that this actually got narrower, much, much, much narrower? What is the standard deviation here? It says 0.043. So 0.043. Finally, it wants us to do a standard deviation of, a sample size of 200, right? This is if, let's say we put 200 M&Ms in each cup. Watch what happens. It got even narrower, didn't it? And what would the standard deviation be? 0.030. Okay. What are we going to put for standard error? So this standard deviation stuff, we got this from the simulation. But how are we going to get the standard error? This comes from the formula. Remember our formula. Okay? So how are we going to calculate it? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to my calculator so that you guys can see how I calculate these last three values. Okay guys, so this is where we left off, and we need to now figure out the standard error here for each of these. All right, so we're going to start with the first one, sample size of 10. Sample size of 10. So remember, this is going to be, the standard error is p times 1 minus p, and it's the square root. So it's going to be 0.24 times 1 minus 0.24, and then divided by, the sample size is 10. Now for the second one, it's going to be the exact same thing, except the sample size is going to change to 100. So it's going to be 0.24 times 1 minus 0.24 divided by 100. And then for the third one, it's going to be 0.24 times 1 minus 0.24 divided by 200. Okay, so I'm going to put each of these in my calculator, and I'm going to figure out what I get. So here's our calculator here. So first one is going to be, I'm going to do second square root again. And then I have 0.24 times parentheses 1 minus 0.24, close parentheses, divided by 10. If I hit enter on that, I get 0.135. So let's go ahead and put that on our table here. I get 0.135. Next one, I need to change that bottom to 100. I'll give you guys a little trick. If you ever want to repeat something and then just change a little thing there, you can do, you can type it all over again, or you can do second entry down here. See above the enter is the blue word entry. So I'm going to do second and then entry, and it repeats it, except I'm now going to go back in and make it 100 instead. So if I hit enter on that, you'll notice I get 0.043. I'm going to round it to a 3. 0.043. So coming back here, 0.043. Okay. Last one here. We want to change it now to 200 to see what happens. So if we come back over to our calculator, I'm going to do again second entry, but now I'm going to go in there and I'm going to change that to say 200. And I'm going to hit enter. I get 0.030. So I'm going to write that in right here, 0.030. What do we notice here? These numbers are close, aren't they? These numbers are close, these numbers are close, and these numbers are close. The standard deviations in the second row are from the 1,000 simulated sample proportion. So everything you see in this second row, that's from the simulation. What's that third row? These are the theoretical standard errors of all of them, which means if we do this experiment forever, that's what we expect the curve to look like. Okay. How do they compare? Well, they're really close, aren't they? They're really close. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to write that down for our answer. So let's write that down. The answers are very similar. So let's go ahead and answer the last few questions here. It says, as we increase the sample size, what happens to the spread of the distribution of sample proportions? Well, we saw it in the simulation and we also saw it right here. We saw that as our sample size got bigger and bigger, our standard errors got smaller, didn't they? Which means that our picture in our simulation got narrower. So I'll say, as we increase the sample size, the spread got smaller. Or another way to say that is narrower, right? Was your answer to question 13A correct? Yes. 13A was correct. Okay. And very last question. As we increase the sample size, what happens to the standard error of sample proportions? Well, the standard error got smaller, didn't it? Right? We went from 0.135 to 0.043 to 0.030, so they did get smaller. So the standard error of sample proportions decreased as we increase the sample size. Okay? That is it for this lesson. If we look over here at the take it home, you are going to need to use that spreadsheet, and you're going to do a similar experiment and fill out these tables. So it should be pretty straightforward. So make sure that you have a calculator handy as well as Microsoft Excel. Thank you guys very much for watching, and the code word is blue candy. Okay, blue candy. I'll write that right here. Code word, that you're going to submit is blue candy. Okay. Thanks very much for watching, guys.